ritual purity. Law number 96. Anyone who touches or eats the carcass of an unclean animal becomes ritually unclean. Leviticus 11, 8, and 24. Their meat you shall not eat, and their carcasses you shall not touch. They are unclean to you. And by these you will make yourself become unclean. Whoever touches the carcass of any of them will be unclean until sunset. Law number 97. Anyone who touches or eats the carcass of a clean animal that dies of itself or is torn by wild animals becomes ritually unclean. Leviticus 11, 39 through 40. If an animal you are allowed to eat dies, he who touches its carcass shall be unclean until sunset. Anyone who eats of its carcass shall wash his clothes and be unclean until sunset. He also who carries its carcass shall wash his clothes and be unclean until sunset. Leviticus 17:15. Anyone, whether he is a native of your own country or a stranger who eats anything found dead or torn by wild animals, he shall both wash his clothes and bathe in water and be unclean until sunset, then he shall be clean. Law number 98. Articles that come in contact with sources of ritual uncleanness become ritually unclean. Leviticus 11, 32, and 34. When one of them dies and falls on something, that article, whatever its use, shall be unclean, whether an item of wood, clothing, skin, or sack. Whatever item it is that is used in work, it must be put in water, and it shall be unclean until sunset, then it shall be clean. Any food that could be eaten but has water on it from such a vessel is unclean, and any liquid that could be drunk from it is unclean. Law number 99. Menstruous women are ritually unclean. Leviticus 15, 19 through 24. When a woman's flow of blood, nida, zava, has ended, she will continue in her impurity for 7 days. Anyone who touches her during this time will be unclean until sunset. Anything she lies on during her period will be unclean, and anything she sits on will be unclean. Whoever touches her bed must wash his clothes and bathe with water, and he will be unclean until sunset. Whoever touches anything she sits on must wash his clothes and bathe with water, and he will be unclean until sunset. Whether it is the bed or anything she was sitting on, when anyone touches it, he will be unclean until sunset. If a man lies with her and her monthly flow touches him, he will be unclean for 7 days. Any bed he lies on will be unclean. Law number 100. Women after childbirth are ritually unclean. Leviticus 12, 2 to 5. Speak to the children of Israel, saying, if a woman has conceived and gives birth to a male child, then she shall be unclean 7 days, as in the days of her monthly period. She shall be unclean. On the 8th day, the flesh of his foreskin must be circumcised. She shall then continue in the blood of her purification 33 more days. She shall not touch any holy thing, kodesh, nor come into any consecrated place, mikvash, until the days of her purification are over, for a total of 40 days. However, if she gives birth to a female child, then she shall be unclean 2 weeks, 14 days, as in her monthly period, and she shall continue in the blood of her purification 66 more days, for a total of 80 days. Law number 101. Anyone with a spreading skin disease is ritually unclean. Leviticus 13, 2 to 3. When anyone has a swelling or a rash or a bright spot on his skin that may become an infectious skin disease like leprosy, then he shall be brought to Aaron the priest or to one of his sons the priest. The priest shall look at the sore on the skin of the body, and if the hair on the sore has turned white and the sore appears deeper than the rest of his skin, it is an infectious skin disease. When the priest examines him, he shall pronounce him ceremonially unclean. Law number 102. Any clothing contaminated with a spreading disease is ritually unclean. Leviticus 13, 47, 50 to 51. And if any clothing is contaminated with mildew, woolen or linen clothing, the priest is to examine the mildew and isolate the articles in question for 7 days. On the 7th day he is to re-examine it, and if the mildew has spread in the clothing, in the woven or knitted material, or in the leather, whatever its use, it is a destructive mildew, the article is unclean. Law number 103. A house contaminated by a spreading disease is ritually unclean. Leviticus 14, 34, and 44. When you enter the land of Canaan, which I give you as a possession, and I put a spreading mildew in a house in that land, then the priest is to go and examine it again, and if the mildew has spread in the house, it is a destructive mildew. The house is unclean. Law number 104. A man having an abnormal discharge, Zob, is ritually unclean. Leviticus 15, verse 2. Speak to the children of Israel and say to them, when any man has a discharge, that discharge is unclean. Law number 105. Anyone or anything coming into contact with semen becomes ritually unclean. Leviticus 15, 16 to 18. When any man has an emission of semen, then he shall bathe all his body in water, and he will be unclean until sunset. Any clothing or leather that has semen on it must be washed with water, and it will be unclean until sunset. When a man lies with a woman, and there is an emission of semen, both must bathe with water, and they will be unclean until sunset. Law number 106. A woman with an abnormal discharge, Zaba, is ritually unclean. Leviticus 15, 19, 25 to 28. When a woman's flow of blood, Nida, Zava, has ended, she will continue in her impurity for 7 days. Anyone who touches her during this time will be unclean until sunset. When a woman has a discharge of blood for many days at a time other than her monthly period, Zava, or has a discharge that continues beyond her period, Zava, she will be unclean as long as she has the discharge. She will be unclean just as in the days of her period. Any bed she lies on while her discharge continues will be unclean, as her bed is during her monthly period, and anything she sits on will be unclean just as during her monthly period. Whoever touches them will be unclean. He must wash his clothes and bathe with water, and he will be unclean until sunset. When her discharge has finally stopped, she must count off 7 clear days, then she must purify herself. Law number 107. A human corpse and anyone who comes near it is ritually unclean. Numbers 19, 11 to 14. He who touches the dead body of anyone shall be unclean 7 days. He must purify himself with the water of the red heifer after the 3rd day and after the 7th day. Then he will be clean. But if he does not purify himself after the 3rd day and after the 7th day, he will not be clean. Whoever touches the dead body of anyone and fails to purify himself defiles the tabernacle of Yahweh. That person shall be cut off from Israel. He shall remain unclean because the water of purification was not sprinkled on him. His uncleanness is still on him. This is the law that applies when a person dies in a tent. Anyone who enters the tent and anyone who is in it will be unclean for 7 days. Law number 108. The purification water purifies the ritually unclean. Numbers 19, 9. Then a man who is clean shall gather up the ashes of the red heifer and put them in a ceremonially clean place outside the camp. They shall be kept by them for the congregation of the children of Israel, for the water of purification from impurity. It is for purifying from sin. Law number 109. Those ritually unclean must purify at the appointed time by laundering their clothes and immersing in water. Leviticus 15, 27. Whoever touches them will be unclean. He must wash his clothes and bathe with water, and he will be unclean until sunset. Law number 110. Those ritually unclean of a spreading skin disease must follow the specified purification procedure. Leviticus 14, verse 2. This shall be the law for the leprous or diseased person, for the day of his cleansing, when he shall be brought to the priest. Law number 111. Those unclean of a spreading skin disease must shave off all their hair. Leviticus 14:9. On the 7th day he must shave off all his hair. He must shave his head, his beard, his eyebrows, and the rest of his hair. He must wash his clothes and bathe himself with water, and then he will be clean. Law number 112. Those unclean of a spreading skin disease must be easily distinguishable. Leviticus 13:45. The person with such an infectious disease must wear torn clothes, uncover his head, cover the lower part of his face, and cry out, unclean, unclean. Law number 113. The ashes of the red heifer are to be used in ritual purification. Numbers 19, 2 and 9. This is a statute of the law of Yahweh has commanded, saying, speak to the children of Israel and tell them to bring you a red heifer without blemish or defect, and that has never been under a yoke, never having been used for secular purposes. Then a man who is clean shall gather up the ashes of the red heifer and put them in a ceremonial clean place outside the camp. They shall be kept by them for the congregation of the children of Israel for the water of purification from impurity. It is for purifying from sin.